Welcome to the 2-Month Review. This is a weekly podcast in which we go over one particular book, bit by bit, section by section, appreciating it, exploring it, understanding it, enjoying it. And this month, or for the next 2 months, we'll be talking about Tómas Jónsson Bestseller by Gudbjörg Bergson. And by we, I mean myself, Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and Lytton Smith from a variety of places, but mainly known as, in this case, as the translator of Tómas Jónsson's book. And this week we have a special guest with us, and that is Scott Esposito, who sent me his bio. Well, Scott Esposito, although on my calendar for our recording today, somehow it like auto-corrected it to Scott Esposito. So you're just Esposito for today.
What is an expositor?
I don't know, but it sounds awesome. Like you're just it left off Scott. It was just the Esposito. Anyway,
I kind of like that.
Yeah, me too. You should go back. You should make it your wrestler name. It'd be a good wrestler name. So you are the author of 4 books. I know you initially through Conversational Reading and the Quarterly Conversation, and then through the Center for the Art of Translation, where you work on 2 lines. You work on both the books and the magazine side of things, as well as the center as a whole, correct? Yeah. And then also as a reviewer for innumerable places, and specifically you list them as Times Literary Supplement, San Francisco Chronicle, Bomb Magazine, Tin House, White Review, Lifted Brow, The Believer, The Washington Post, and others. You also have a couple books. One is, was it The End of the Aleppo?
The End of the Aleppo, question mark,
yeah. I thought my inflection was not quite Minnesota enough, but got us there to question mark. And then most recently, which comes out, I guess, next month, I thought it was just out, but is The Doubles from Civil Coping Mechanisms. Before we get into like the book, Tómas Jónsson and the book itself, and you actually interviewed Lytton, so this is going to be an extra interesting section. Oh, which I should mention, too, for people following along and reading along, the section that we will be talking about is the 4th composition book, which is pages 32 through 68. But before we get into that, what is The Doubles about? Like, I've seen you reference it a few times online, and I know that I've seen the cover of it, and I know that it was coming out soon and that you're doing events in New York for it. But do you want to explain it in your own words?
Yeah, for sure. So this is kind of like a mix of genres. It's basically a memoir through film / the impact that film has had on my life / what film and art can do to all of us. Basically, I take 14 films that have impacted me a lot, and it's one per year. I cover about 20 years of my life, so like from 1996 to 2016.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is the starting point, I assume.
Yeah, I'm watching. Errol Morris's A Brief History of Time is 1996, which is actually a total outlier because at that point in my life, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure was much more my style. But part of the point of the book is that even stuff like that, even stuff that is, not considered classic film as part of pop culture, that can really kind of get into you and can really kind of affect the way you see yourself, you see the world, the way you act, kind of the persona that you represent as whatever your performance of yourself. So, there are some films that aren't exactly canonical cinema in the book because it is all about, this is just a medium that's everywhere, and there's all kinds of films that are constantly getting into us all the time. So I picked 14, and one essay per film. I retell the 14 of them, and I'm throwing in all kinds of other stuff, just kind of reading the films, explaining how they've gotten into me, throwing in a lot of kind of like quotations and just kind of riffs and other things, trying to open up the film and show everything that's in there that kind of brought to the culture.
Yeah, I would imagine that there would have to be films that aren't like the canonical. Otherwise, that would be kind of crazy. Like just the way that film and movies and everything infiltrates the world and your life. Like that makes a lot of sense. What are some of the films that you include?
Yeah, I can run down a few of them really quick. I was just giving this thing the last proof, so I got the table of contents right here. Yeah, so, Brief History of Time, Clockwork Orange, some kind of more classic stuff. And then some offbeat stuff like The Five Obstructions by Lars von Trier, Koyaanisqatsi, which is kind of this crazy thing that came out in the 80s as kind of a cult film. one called Capturing the Freedmans.
Yeah,
which was actually, I guess, started.
Cool.
That thing is crazy, and it actually started life as like an HBO special. I didn't even know this, but then kind of became like more of a film.
Yeah, it's about clowns. It was about clowns.
Yeah, one of the guys, he's a clown.
Well, yeah, but that's how it started. Was he was going to do a video on clowns that go and work with kids, but then ended up that the guy they talked to, his dad had this crazy story. So I grew up in a school that had one of those situations where the guy that was our play director and computer teacher was accused of molesting one kid, and they became 30 kids all overnight, basically. I was part of all of those. I wasn't one of the people, but I was in all the in all the plays and in all the classes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that when I watched that movie was like a real impactful movie for me too. Wow, this feels like it's 10 o'clock. I have wine. This is becoming like the psychologist 2 month review on the psychologist chair. 2 months of reviewing your life.
This is great because this is exactly what you're supposed to do. Like when you read the book, you're supposed to be like, oh yeah, that reminds me about this, and it's supposed to be very relatable because it's all about this is this big medium that is just everywhere, and we all have all these point of entries to it, no matter what film we're talking about.
So I have a question. This is a segue to you, Lytton. I just finished reading your next translation, Narrator by Bragi Olufsen, which is based around a movie called Le Grand Buffet. Is that how you pronounce it correctly?
Le Grand Bouffe, I think.
Le Grand Bouffe.
But I'm not a French expert, but yeah.
Have you seen that movie, Scott?
No. What's it about?
So the book Narrator is about a guy that's trailing this other guy through the streets of Reykjavik, and they end up at this movie that's a 70s French-Italian movie about four guys who decide to go to a cabin with a bunch of prostitutes and eat themselves to death. And
nice.
It's like a comedy, but also like... it's a comedy, but like the part that stands out in the book is how the one guy's like never farts because his mom didn't want him to, and he just eats so much of this food, and it's also gluttonous that he just starts like getting sick and going out on the balcony and making these disgusting noises, and eventually like dies through shitting himself.
I think the imagination of that film is all I need. But the funny thing is, I was actually with Bragi Olufsen, the author, at his rural summer cabin this summer, and he had a copy of the film with him. And sort of, I think the half expectation was that I might watch it that evening or during the course of the night. And like there were the kids were sleeping in the loft, and I was just like, this feels like a movie that you just can't just throw on when there's other people around, right? It's like group sex and people eating themselves to death and shitting themselves to death, and so it was also a really weird thing to translate because like the first part of the novel is basically a summary of that movie or some of the scenes in the movie, and so I'm translating it and I'm just like, my Icelandic must be off because is this guy like really doing what I think he's doing, and so it's fun. It'd be fun. So that's the narrator by Bragi Olufsen.
And he was interested. You can actually get the movie, you can rent it through iTunes and through YouTube, I believe, as well. Now the YouTube one didn't indicate explicitly that it had subtitles, and the preview is only in French, so I hesitate to endorse that fully, but iTunes definitely has it. So I was totally good. I almost watched it last night. In fact, I finished the book and I was just like, what in the fuck is this movie?
I think when we launch the narrator, we're going to have to do a screening at Eastman House.
Absolutely.
And see what happens.
Class the place up.
I also want to say to Scott, I want to ask Scott, if I say to you, Scott, hello to Jason Isaacs, does that mean anything to you?
Jason Isaacs. I don't think it does.
Yeah. No. Okay. So we're going to have to talk Witainment and Cult British podcast. This is a bit of intra podcast. If anybody out there listening to 2 Month Review is also a member of the Church of Witainment, then drop me an email or send me a tweet or something, because we've got some intra podcast things which are now mystifying Chad and Scott. But I'll explain off air.
Awesome. I think I know what you're talking about a little bit, but that's perfect. So. You guys actually did an interview about this book, and that might be the easiest way, before we get into just my attempt to try and describe what happens in this section. you Scott, you interviewed Lytton. Did you have any I got a post, we posted about this interview already, and I'll include a link to it on the post for this particular episode. But you asked him 7 questions. I don't know if you had any grand takeaways, because it sounded like you interviewed him before you started reading the novel, correct?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Was there anything that from that interview, which is great, and everyone should read it and should read it in full? A lot of insightful questions and very interesting answers from you, Lytton. But I wonder for you, Scott, after interviewing and having an idea of what this book was going to be like, then you start reading it. How did that compare?
I think you go to the classic line, the translator is the best advocate for the book, because he or she is the person who has really lived with this text and has seen it up close for so long and really, really gets it. And I think that's kind of what the interview is. I mean, like you said, I did the interview before I read the book. I was just kind of flying blind. A lot of times when I do these interviews, I kind of see what the translator is saying and try to respond to that and kind of let the translator lead the discussion. And really, I was not surprised. After doing the interview with Lytton, I was not surprised reading the book. I thought he was dead on. I thought he really, the reference points were very on track, kind of the feel of the book, the way the prose works, the challenges, the trickiness of working with this particular book. I thought he was really on point with all that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I think if you haven't read the book and you're curious about the book and you look at the interview, you're going to get a really good sense about what this whole thing is about.
I think
that's awesome. That's really really reassuring, Scott. And it's funny because one of the things that I found, Scott had great questions and they led me in some interesting directions. And one of the things I found is I ended up talking, as people who read the interview will see, about the role of this book in relation to America at this moment. And I think when I was answering Scott's questions, we just had Donald Trump Jr. releasing his emails. And it seems kind of fitting because the 4th composition book starts with this, these lines of poetry where the narrator figure, Tómas, says, "I see myself in my nation's streams." And then pretty quickly there's this odd reference where he talks about August passes swiftly, Iceland is some kind of Hawaii. And there's also a reference to, which a line that I think we've got to get printed up as a 2-month review T-shirt or something, but there's a line to Reykjavik as being the Venice of the Arctic.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's hilarious. But there's that sense in this, this book is constantly working away with that question of what does it mean to be Icelandic and what is Iceland? And maybe the only way to talk about Iceland is to talk about Hawaii or America or Venice or something.
Yeah, there is a specific part in here, too. I think it's in this section where he says, the other countries should listen to what we have to say. Yeah. I think that's in this one and not in the next one, yeah. To try and summarize this for anyone listening, 4th composition book, pages 32 through 68, involves a few different major themes. The first, it opens up with essentially the date, 8/9/1967, is one of the earlier parts. Talks about him and voting, in relation to voting, how he gets up. He's kind of going about his day, and there's a huge emphasis for the beginning part of this book on how, systematic and organized and thoughtful he is in his thoughts and his daily actions and the way that he does things. And this is the part that reminds me the most of Beckett at this moment. And then we go into a stray sort of toss-off bit about how the CEO of the bank where he works at embezzled a bunch of money or lost a bunch of money. Then goes on to talk about how you should be there's a lot of writing stuff that's going to come up in the next section too, but here it starts to appear where he's there could be ghostwriters forever. Everyone in America could write these ghostwrite these books for famous shipbuilders or people who were lumpfish kings. And he has this bit that I want to talk about in more detail, which he sort of summarizes that, goes through a bit of his dreams, then it ends up with creating a weird opera / sort of folktale that we need to talk about too, followed by what's one of the more interesting sections where he talks about his being at work in relation to the CEO and how the CEO is treated, and then apparently seems to have gotten fired, from the best that I can understand, or maybe decipher, maybe. Right. And then kind of goes into a little bit more of his romantic inclinations towards the other woman at the bank, and a bit about her being really good at bank counting. That's essentially the plot, I think. I don't know if I left out anything important. I don't know that that's a plot, but but this section has a bunch of those themes, and a lot of these seem, now that I've reread ahead and sort of like re-noticed a lot of the same things, a lot of these keep coming up over the next few sections. So it seems like a good one to build groundwork too for like how to deal with his kind of maniacal way of shoving everything together, and also like how these pieces sort of resonate with other parts of the book.
Yeah, and I mean, he's, I think the fact that we get a lot about his, his illness, and this, this composition of books ends with him needing this oxygen mask, and it takes place in 1967. So, we're right at the end of his life, and so. And yet he's casting back in memory. There's also a reference to this character Loa, and this reference to her being raped, and that's another, like, this big plot point in the novel. And we'll sort of, it's set up before we get to it. But this question of whether Tómas has raped this girl, or whether he was accused of doing it because it looked like he was doing it, but actually what he was doing was quite innocent, bizarrely enough, and he actually just gave her a nosebleed. And so there's these ways that he's kind of trying to construct, like with the question of, did he get fired? Did he quit? Does he imagine he's still working there? Because he's clearly not, because he's just lying around at home all the time. But he's trying to sort of construct a narrative for himself. And I think that's where the folktale that Chad was talking about comes in, right? Because, it's the first moment where we get one of these, often quite bizarre. This one is about, this farmer and how he gets married to this farmhand, and sort of bizarre sleeping arrangements, and there's this fascination with sleeping arrangements and people farting in bed all through the novel, right? Like, this is the Breaking Wind issue of the podcast, right? And so it just seems like, he's both like parodying Icelandic sort of folk tales, but also really relying on them at the same time, and that's the double-headedness of this book.
So I had a couple of things. When you're talking about the farting and whatnot, that reminded me, I guess, the preceding section of the book, I guess what would be covered in the first podcast. There's all that stuff about like the noise regulations. And I mean, he lives in this apartment and he's really, really, really on top of like every little sound his neighbors are making. And he's like brokering these arrangements with them. So I don't know. I mean, just to kind of build on that, I guess that becomes more and more pronounced throughout the book. But I wanted to ask about this folktale thing. I mean, this thing is fairly long. It takes up a bit of this section, and I guess it's kind of interesting. Like you were saying, it's sort of a parody. I mean, I know like in modernism, kind of going back to the land, and getting like the folk tales from the people, or like the folk songs that would then become these, big symphonic compositions of high art. Like there was a whole big thing about getting those pieces of kind of, the people's art and putting them into high art. And you definitely see that in a literary film. But then what you're saying here about how it's kind of this parody, I mean, is this like kind of the beginning of a postmodern turn where instead of just like taking the folk art stuff and making it into high literature, you're just going to parody that whole thing and just totally mess it up and, make it into this total kind of screwy version of what the folktale was.
Yeah, I mean, and like he writes this folktale he's claiming authorship of it, but it's explicitly a draft for the Icelandic opera, and I mean, there's something, I think even Icelanders would sort of chuckle a little bit. It's sort of funny about the Icelandic opera, because obviously the Icelandic opera is very, very good, but it's the Icelandic opera. It's not got the national reach that a lot of this stuff is thinking about. But also this weird thing about like writing about this farmer and this serving girl and a winter laborer and like their stinky feet in bed in the form of an opera. It's just like the most bizarre mix of things coming together.
Yeah.
I like, and this points ahead a little bit, and this is maybe laying the groundwork for future sections. But in the next composition book, or the one thereafter, I think it's the one right after that, would be number 6. There's a ton of different pieces like this, and it keeps reinventing different characters, and almost like it's testing out different modes of trying to write. And in that section explicitly, it like makes fun of a lot of like what writing is for, and this one does too, because this is like I'm going to save it for then, but one of my favorite lines is in this, of the whole book, is in this section. But I feel like the sort of that kind of parody, that folktale about the farmer, it reminds me a little bit of Laxness again. I think everything will, because I've been listening to independent people, and it's like in my brain. But that kind of like very, not stoic, but sort of I'm looking for, like frugal, very controlled, very like, oh, we all need to sleep in the same beds. Here's how we'll do it. This is efficient. And it's like kind of at the same time sort of grotesque when they start imagining and acknowledging their own bodies, and like becomes sort of a joke. And it plays off of like how he keeps thinking of himself as being so systematic. He's so organized in his thought. He keeps his weekend shoes pointed in the right direction. He only wears them on the weekend. He does things in this way. He hates when people are like, get out of line. And this book is absolutely the opposite of that. Like he is not that, and yet wants to try and force his way of sort of showing himself to be that way. And in a sense, like these different narratives seem to be almost like testing out a way to create a narrative for himself. Like you sort of alluded to, of like him sort of experimenting with how to give himself a story and how to make a story out of this life in a way.
I love that way of seeing it, and I think I think a good book really teaches you how to read it. And I think as a translator, you've got to go on that journey and sort of say, not just, do I understand the language in order to translate this, but do I understand the project? And we often think about language when we're translating, but I think actually sort of like project and approach are important. So like right at the start of the book, it begins with this 3-line biography of like, I'm descended from the bluest-eyed Vikings. And he's like, no, because he knows it's bullshit, right? And so I like that idea. This is a book where he's constantly trying to restart like a way of telling his own story. And he actually says there's this really weird relationship he has with this character in the bank, Miss Gerther, who appears, in this section, and she's like awesome at counting banknotes, and he's winning all these banknote counting competitions, which I'm like, is that a real thing? Is that what people in banks do? But then there's this also really uncomfortable scene where he's like sexualizing the way that she's sitting on the desk in front of him, and it's kind of like Sharon Stone, Basic Instinct a little bit. And then because of what happens there, he just says, I'm going to write only badly of her after this point. And he kind of does for the rest of the novel, right? He's kind of like really just mean to her. And that's the power he has.
So, two things related to that. One is that there is a thing for librarians called the, it's a library cart dance routine thing that they do. They have a competition, like world competitions, where they put together dance routines in which you use book carts. There's a book cart drill team. That's what they call it, book cart drill team. And they have national competitions at these conferences where they do like these long orchestrated bits involving costumes and hip hop and everything else. And that the banknote thing reminds me of that immediately. It's like something that
I'm leaving this podcast right now to go and watch YouTube videos, Chad. I'm sorry, Scott. I'm just gonna spend the next half hour on that.
I will link to one of those too, and I will send you one, and you're just gonna be like, there's no, this has to be a parody, but it's not. But the other thing is, it doesn't that section about him saying that he's never gonna talk nice about her again come right after he talks about how she would have been a good wife as well? Right. It's like, it's really like she gets like harassed in this section in particular, because they're like, there's a bit that references like her quote unquote peppery play. Yeah, on page 55. Where he talks about like how she plays little jokes on people, and so finally the one guy, is it Sigurdur? I'm not sure how you say that. Puts like a used condom in her pocket, and like, which is just like, that's a pretty big escalation.
Yeah,
and that's literally harassment. And then she goes back to being this sort of like cagey, like he's sort of attracted to her, thinks she'd be a good wife, but also never going to talk good about her again. Done.
All right. I think yeah, go on, Scott.
Oh, I just wanted to toss out a question, maybe for the both of you. I'm just a little curious about like the context that this book came out of. Like, I know, Lytton, when we did the interview, you were saying how this book is really scandalous and really divided people, and it just kind of became this big monument in the middle of Icelandic literature, and now everyone has an opinion about it, and it's just something that you have to feel some way about. Which, I mean, I guess some of the content was definitely causing that polarization, but I would also guess that part of just the way that this book is built caused a lot of polarization. And so I was curious about, like, this is the 1960s when this comes out, like 66 or 67. Some of the books that you're pointing to as antecedents, like Tristram Shandy, which is very clear. There's so much digressiveness. There's so much slapstick. There's so much kind of shaggy dogness to it. Another antecedent, Ulysses, where again, it's clearly there. Like it's all kind of stream of conscious. This guy's kind of narrating the stuff as he goes through it. It's very just kind of quotidian, day-to-day stuff that he's talking about. I mean, so these antecedents are books that have been around for a while before the 60s, and they're kind of part of the heritage of world literature. So I guess I'm curious, like, despite the fact of there being a long lineage of this kind of writing in Iceland, did this book still feel like it came out of nowhere as regards how it was made? Or like, was there stuff in Icelandic literature where people could, like stepping stones that was kind of building up to something like this?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the way it's always been cast by Good Bugger Bugs and by his followers is that this really was like a sort of a work of genius. He did an introduction to a 2012 edition of the book in Iceland, and the way he chose to orient the book in that was saying that he wrote about what he found living inside him. Right, that he wasn't working with existing artworks before and afterwards. He was deliberately turning away from that to create something new. And it's a good question for this section as well, because there are these references which I'm kind of curious as to how much they sort of settle in with an American-based reader. But there's these references to like the sort of the prominent biographies, right? So there's this guy about like Callie the Lumpfish King, right? And his biography is like a bestseller. And what Bergson is doing there is he's sort of playing with this idea that like the literary form in Iceland before Tómas Jónsson was the biography. And it was particularly this biography of somebody who was like maybe a captain of industry or something like that. And it was very much a hagiography of sort of really sort of bigging up that person. And so, and Tómas Jónsson within this, one way to describe the plot of this book is somebody who's trying to write his own biography, despite not having really a biography to write. And yet managing to do something that's much more artistic and creative than anyone else has done before.
I have a related question to you on that. So you talk about like Ulysses or Tristram Shandy. I assume that neither of those are translated into Icelandic prior to the 1960s, but most people in Iceland can read in English. Would most people have read something like Ulysses, though, in English? Or is that sort of like, it's Ulysses stuff? I mean, people who know English don't read that. Like, and if you're like, oh, that's my second language, I'll just go fucking dive into Ulysses now.
Right. I mean, there's such a highly literate people that like it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But and I feel like I'm off my expertise here. I mean, an Icelandic studies professor, listening to this is probably sort of throwing things at the computer or radio or MP3.
Whatever. But that's what you want. Send us an email.
That's my fault for
Give us a
going
rating.
there.
Give us a rating on iTunes.
Pour another glass of wine and deal with it. But I would imagine that like that Ulysses probably wasn't something that people were had in mind. But one of the things that Scott and I were talking about in that interview was the importance of trying to find the touchstone, like what's the equivalent book or set of books in an American reader's mind, so that you can translate it with those things in in mind. And so like one book I talked about in the interview with Scott is Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, which is one of my favorite novels of all time. And it's so different from this in many ways, and much more coherent, but it's a really great unreliable narrator novel. And I sort of feel like, and it's a work of modernism that fits in with some of the stuff going on here. So I think if you've read that, then and it's also a work of about the unreliable narrator, which I think has some pretty big questions to ask about how men see women, right? And I think, again, that's, a lot of this section we're talking about tonight is about problematic ways that men see and act towards women.
Absolutely. Speaking on that, I have one question that's a very specific question that someone listening might have as well, is that there's a reference. Oh, shoot. I just had it and I lost it. Let me see if I can find it again. Okay. So on page 54, he's gone through various digressions, which I'm going to come back to in a second, about his story ending, blah, blah, blah. He talks about Miss Girder, all that kind of stuff. Then it says, I leapt to my feet. I had to yank open the door. I had to talk to them with a commanding expression, authoritative. And all of a sudden, I feel like that section goes back to the first moment, one of the first moments when we talked about last week, where he hears his lodgers coming home and having sex in the hallway. And this is super disturbing to him. And I feel like that keeps coming back as one of his main hangups. Is this the same? Is this a different thing, or am I maybe reading too much into this and trying to see a pattern that's maybe not there? Or does that keep going back to that moment in time? It's like, that's a huge moment for him. Like the idea that these people are just like copulating outside of his doorway as he's lying there unable to breathe.
No, I totally think it is, and I totally think he's this sort of lonely old man who's like confined to his room, and he has these, either whether there's sort of moments of like sort of sexual teasing by women who live in his apartment, or moments of sexual fantasy that he has by them through the book. Oh yeah. And I just think he's really troubled both by like, sex as something that human beings do, but also by the fact that there are human beings having sex in his house, close to his room, like not even in their rooms. And he's kind of pissed off by kids as well.
Oh yeah.
Fuck
kids.
So, right, exactly,
up.
Right,
Yeah.
And I think part of that is about the fact that, like, to have kids, you have to have sex, right? Sorry to break it to people listening on the podcast, but that's how it works. And so, like, he's really seeing this link between like, they're a reminder of the sex that he's not having, I think.
That there is something about his, like, joy in his body, like all of his bodily functions, he's more than happy to talk about. But then, like, the second that they come in conflict with another outside person, as with, I think, a lot of people in the world, that becomes more problematized. And, like, then the sex issue comes up, the like power structures come up, all that kind of stuff comes up. But like, it is kind of a weird tension about his body, or looking in the body. Even this is the section where isn't this the section that has a quote about like memories are stored in your flesh, and maybe I just don't, my flesh is too fat for me to like have these memories anymore.
Yeah.
Here it is. Maybe it's on 45. Maybe I'm too fat to be able to remember anything for more than a moment. The outer surface of my body is too far away from my soul. Aristotle probably came to the same conclusion after he grew older and fatter. Right.
I know. It's, and he's just got these really funny, bizarre moments. And there's something really smart and insightful that Bergson said in, like, he also did a preface for a 1987 edition. So the book had 3 editions in Iceland, 67, 87, 2012. And it is 87. And it's kind of funny reading the prefaces because he's a very different person at each moment. But in the 87 preface, he talked about, like, the way that the people in Tómas Jónsson's army are deliberately cast as a kind of foreign, in his apartment, are cast as a foreign army, right? And that Tómas Jónsson's problem is that, like, he wants to be independent, right? And Laxness's independent people is obviously in the background there, but he doesn't want to be so independent that he isn't making money from other people, this foreign army. And so the phrase that Bergson uses, he says that Jónsson's profit was a certain type of losing. And I think that's really interesting, like when you're making a profit, but you're still losing because of it. And I think there's that same thing with the flesh, right? Like sort of like, he's become like this really fat figure, and that's a kind of losing in the sense that like his soul is further away from the edges of his body as far as he understands it.
So, really Chad, I've got a question for you. This book is like crazy in terms of just like the format of it.
Oh God!
Some of the paragraphs are indented. Some of the paragraphs aren't indented. Sometimes there are periods. Sometimes there aren't. There's just lots of spaces where you wouldn't necessarily expect lots of spaces to be. Some things are capitalized. Some things aren't. I mean, it's pretty intense as regards all that. So I wanted to ask you, like, how do you edit something like this? And, like, how do you even proofread a book like this?
So we should have Kaya on here in one of the future episodes to talk specifically about that, since she went through it most closely with Lytton and did the first editing, did the copy editing, the editing for it. I did more. I read it when it came in and then stopped and was like, I need to read this when it's laid out because I need to be able to see what it looks like, but also need to see if there's any typos or problems like that. So I tried to proof it when it was laid out, and I think I talked to you, Lytton. We were at an event. And when I was in the middle of it, and I was like, I think I've marked like 8 things in the first like 6 pages, and then stopped because it was like, I'm not sure. And I think there's a few things I caught. There's a typo in this section I didn't catch, which has been recurring. It's a recurring 2-month review joke, is that we've spelled Chekhov wrong in every book ever, because I've, in my mind, spelled Chekhov wrong for my entire life. Like, I did not spell it correctly until about 3 weeks ago. But regardless, so you tried to find... When I was reading it, there a couple moments that I did try and pause at, where when I got to a point where I was like, I don't know that, I think it's gone too far, where I can't, there's something that's off here that I think we do need to dial back, like just one notch. But for the most part, like, as long as I could stop, and there's a lot of the sections where he doesn't have periods. This section does it a lot, but the next section does it even more so, where the middle word that's connecting 2 sentences can be read for both of those sentences. And as long as I saw that, I trusted Lytton, and I trusted that we had the typography right in terms of that. I knew that you had gone through it and made sure that the spaces were right and everything was in the place that it was supposed to be, and trusted that was correct, unless there's something that really, really, really looked wrong, and I just made a question mark next to it. So I mostly ended up just making question marks and leading it back to like see that, to make sure that it was there. But you're right, otherwise there's not a good way to proof it, because like the very first section has like Iceland's capitalized and it's not, and Christmas Eve is not, but obviously should be. There's all that kind of problem, and once you know that that's happening, then it has to be, does each one of these paragraphs consistently, does it make some sort of internal sense, internal logic, which would drive. I had I'll end here without going on too much more about this, but I had two of my students proof this, which is just basically like torture. And one of them did okay with it, and the other one marked up, like, I think she had like 400 corrections in like 80 pages, because it was every single one of those things. It needs to be a period, it needs to be indented, there needs to be capitalized, it needs to be like what a normal book looks like. And it's one of those great moments to be like, you can't apply like the dictionary and the manual of style to every single thing that exists. Otherwise, literature would just be like a biography of a person that catches fish. Like, it would not be interesting. It has to have these things. So, it's kind of a nightmare for that reason. But it also made it exciting to read it and just be like, wow, for once, like, I'm not paying attention to, is this comma in the right place, but paying attention to like, what in the shit is happening here, and how do I even understand this? And there's so many times that like I would get lost and just be like, that's why we wanted to start this podcast, because like I'm not entirely certain. Like, even when he gets fired here, so the CEO like gets away with losing this money, goes through like these blood transfusions in Switzerland, which feels very like of the moment. It's like the Uber CEO taking a break for a couple weeks and like, getting rewired through some sort of blood transfusion. And then Olaf, does Olaf get promoted?
Yeah.
Okay,
but we don't find out the particular details of it, but but that's very much the what seems to have happened. And basically there's this ongoing pattern of Tómas Jónsson getting passed over for other people. So, like, in this section, the plot is that the bank opens a new branch, and so there's a sort of a hidden point about like the expansion of finance and capital. It's really interesting because the word for finance in Icelandic is very closely connected to the word for sheep and cattle. And while, like, that's not like uncommon. So the roots in Old English, there's a similar sort of sharing the roots of the English language there. But even in Iceland today, there are such specific laws about like the compensation if a sheep gets hit by a car in the road and things like that you really can talk of sheep as money in Iceland. And so that there's a play going through it. But so this bank branch opens up, and Tómas Jónsson is sort of convinced he's going to be promoted, mainly because he's just the senior guy. And then the narrative of the novel is very much that like these other people, this character Tryggvi, Olaf, get positions above him. And main reason is because like Tómas Jónsson, he thinks he can keep up with the new technology, but he can't, right? And there's these really sad scenes in the book where he's like struggling, like using a fountain pen at one point and getting ink everywhere. And It's like he's just not fit for purpose in that sense. But the book is turning around and saying, well, maybe the purpose isn't fit. It's not just you don't just cast Thomas Jónsson to the side. You have to rethink the purpose you're trying to achieve.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, and Olaf comes up and it's shortly too. So Olaf's sort of pointing out right here for anyone paying attention. Olaf's sort of important character. But yeah, that's one of those sections where it's I don't know, I'm not certain what just happened. And that's what it makes it both fun and challenging. It makes it challenging to proofread it because you're paying attention to the least important detail, or, not the meta structure, right? You're not thinking about it in a large way. You're looking at that line by line by line and sentence by sentence. And that's kind of complicated. And sort of takes away from the appreciation of being able to say okay, what was this scene that I just read? And how did these things then work out and replay? So reading it in the two different ways is pretty different experience, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Absolutely. I mean, nodding in agreement on this podcast, which is obviously in audio form. So
works perfectly. So, okay.
I just, Lytton, when I talked to you for the interview, one of the comparisons you made, in addition to Ulysses, was Finnegan's Wake. Mm-hmm. And I kept felt like that was appropriate here. I mean, I've not read The Wake in its entirety, but I kind of got a sense of the deal of it, and it seems like who's read that book in its entirety? Some people have.
But
it seems like kind of like a much more kind of cyclical thing where they're kind of they're recurring motifs and things keep popping up, and like Ulysses to me feels like a more you're kind of starting here and you're going through to there. And, it's not like kind of a circle. It's more like a straight line. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I kind of felt like Finnegan's Wake was an interesting comparison to this book, and probably others that operate in the same way, where, as you and Chad are kind of bringing out as you're talking about this book, there are just kind of these recurring motifs that keep coming up and up and up. And that's, I feel like if you're going to make sense of what's going on here, that's an important way to make sense of it, instead of kind of looking, more for a story or something a little more straightforward in this book.
It's not a through line. We often expect, if you're sort of teaching the craft of fiction, you're talking about sort of a through line or an arc. And this is a series of spirals, right? And with all the sense of sort of spiraling out of control. And, to invoke, an Irish compatriot of Joyce's, Yeats, it's sort of the widening Gaia where, sort of things are just sort of chaotic and the center will not hold. But that's a good thing, I think, in this book. I think as a reader, you might have to let go of some of your expectations that things are going to get resolved. But that the things falling apart is actually kind of quite useful and interesting, even if it's not sort of conventionally satisfying for us.
Right, I think it does merge.
I think.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, go ahead.
It does sort of merge the two books in a way, and both of them serve as touch points for various reasons. Ulysses has the wordplay, but there's the understandable way to break down the different sections, whereas The Wake does have a lot more of the flow to it and the sort of digressive nature and that sort of repeating and playing different games on different pages, whereas Ulysses doesn't usually have 7 different styles within one section, unless it's very plotted out, like the maternity ward section, where it goes through the different stages of how to write or writing throughout the ages. And this is more jumbled than Ulysses, and that is closer to Finnegan's Wake in the sense that it shifts its modes very quickly. So I think that they both serve as touchstones, although this is unlike either of those. So if you read Finnegan's Wake or Ulysses, you're gonna be like, well, it's not really like that, but it sort of serves as a way to sort of formulate the overall aesthetic of how do you approach reading this. And one of the things I'm finding, we've done, this is the 3rd episode for this book and the 2nd one that we're talking about it, but one of the things that's striking me really prominently right at this moment is that when I read the book, I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. This is interesting. I like all this. It's great. I love how the language works and how the structure works. And then rereading it or talking about it, all the humor and all the funness, all the enjoyment of that comes out. It's almost like you have to go through the kind of process of trying to puzzle it to be able to see how fun these games are. The fact that he is playing around with that idea of the ambiguity of did he get fired or did he just quit because he's but he's obviously obviously still lying in bed, like at the end of his life. Like that shouldn't be funny. It's kind of funny though, but it is like something that like when you're reading it the first time, you're like, what the fuck's happening? Like I need to have a plot. I need to know what point A, B, and C are. But when you go back to talk about it, you're like, no, I don't need that at all. Like what I like is the fact that it is all of those things at once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. And I think that's, like that makes me feel really happy as a translator, trying to sort of like, hear people being excited about this book as I am, having spent the time I've spent with it.
And I'll direct this to you, Scott, but it's going to bounce right back to you, Lytton. Scott, have you ever ate the ice?
Ate the ice. I've ice skated a few times, and I definitely fallen over during that. But that's about my experience with eating the ice.
Because it comes up here, I think it's twice as a phrase, but on 41, I've never been forced to eat the ice to survive, as the saying goes. And I love that when I marked it as like, that's a great translator moment. But I wondered, like, if, like, just out of context, if that was a saying that you would, and like, you're right, eating the ice is like if you derf, you just like eat the ice. But totally not what it means.
If I'm not mistaken, didn't you bring this up in the interview, Lytton? I thought you.
I think you're right.
That came up.
Yeah, I think it's one of those moments where I'm really interested in the difference. Like, rather than talking about translation, which sort of feels like there's a definite end goal. And like you finish the job. I'm kind of interested in the idea of translating. It's this ongoing activity where you're never quite done with it. And so there's this sense when I'm translating a book, I'm thinking, I don't want this. If somebody reads it and says like, oh, I never realized it was not in another language first, it would almost feel like a bit of a betrayal, right? We want a little bit of a flavor of the original, and so. Like, the Icelandic phrase, I've never eaten the ice. It just seemed like, well, that makes sense if, you're sort of in this country where, like, they didn't have a road around the entire country until 1974. And so, like before then, like, getting across parts of the country involved, like, riding horses through water or taking a detour around the glacier. And, so it could go badly wrong pretty quickly. And so you get that sense of a group of people who, like, are aware that, like, you might get stuck somewhere and all you've got to do is sort of have glacial ice to eat. And so you want to sort of, if it's a moment where the reader thinks of that as slightly clumsy, then I'm kind of fine with that because, like, the fact that we're reading this book in America, there is a clumsiness to that, right? And that doesn't have to be a bad thing.
No, definitely. I mean, that's like, I guess as a translator, that's a question you must ask yourself a lot. I mean, definitely one of the things we always talk about with translation is, it does expand the language. It is kind of, bringing these outside elements in to rejuvenate this kind of closed system that we have here. But then there is a limit to that. And if you're going too far, it's just going to sound like something that sounds, like if you're translating a Chinese text, it's going to sound really, really Chinese, and you could be like, okay, this doesn't sound like English at all. This is not good English.
Yeah,
and I think
the touchstone for me, sorry, Chad, is that it's got to have a kind of comparable effect for the American reader as it does for the Icelandic reader, and so. Like, maybe that phrase in Icelandic at that particular moment would be a bit more straightforward to the Icelandic reader. But the book as a whole is a book where, like I've talked to, highly literate, really well-read Icelanders about parts of this book, and they're like, yeah, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. And so you kind of need that those moments in the English too. Otherwise you're doing something different. You're not translating. You're sort of editing and abridging.
Also, I think for like that idea of like you're stuck somewhere and you have to eat the ice to like survive is a better choice than like eat the humans or eat the flesh, which is the other comparable that comes to mind. But anyways, I think it works great. It's one of those because I like the moments where you're like you say, like you're aware that it's translated and it makes sense and it's interesting that's one of those turning points or like sort of bits that stands out in that way. We should probably start wrapping up here though, and we usually do, Scott, by picking out like a favorite line from the section. You can go first or third if you want. I'm more than happy to go first. Because this has got one of my. I've got it.
Yeah, I don't think you should go first. I'm going to need a minute to. God, there's a lot to work with here.
I know, and you could choose anything. There's so many. On 42, I have with triple exclamation points. What's literature but mental masturbation for the emotions? which is hands down one of my favorite lines ever.
Yeah, no. When I was translating that line, I was definitely like, "This is an open letter book."
Yep.
I was also thinking AWP T-shirt, but we'll talk about that later.
Screw AWP.
That'll be next week's podcast. My line is it's kind of a line that surprised me. I didn't think I was going to pick something like this, but it's on page 38 where he says the kids buzz around their parents' heads and objects buzz around the heads of both the kids and the parents. And I think I love that partly because he's not just creating these kids as kind of like these sort of like bees or insects or something, but it's almost as if things are detached from their physical laws, right? So the kids are kind of levitating and not obeying the laws of gravity. But yeah, I think you also get a sense from that sentence just how carefully he structures an individual sentence, right? With these parallels and repetitions and accumulations. And so for anyone who's sort of listening to us talk about the book and thinking it sounds a bit like a chaotic mess, it completely isn't, right? It's so well honed and crafted at every moment. It just refuses to play by the rules.
That is something that next week that I really want to get into a little bit is how patterned these sections are. Because I think that there is, we mentioned it when we were talking to Anastasia of I was trying to look for his way his thought kind of progresses, and there are a few times that it stood out in this section. There's a movement from a cat jumping down to then the next section immediately it begins with the word jump and sort of follows through that, but also he moves from waking up through coffee, which coffee leads to the lack of coffee, which leads to his death. He's got there is a pattern in that, but even as whole sections, these composition books I don't think are as disorganized as they appear on first glance. I think that Loa is mentioned on page 3 and also a few pages from the end. There's a few moments that kind of recur and give you the feeling that this is there's a little bit more guidance going on than one might expect, which is interesting, and also a delay for you, Scott. I bought you some time.
I appreciate that, actually. But I was prepared. So, okay, I have this one here that's it's almost code-like in its perfection. It's a different side of this book than we were talking about. Animals are true to themselves, which leads to a life perfected. And the thing that I love about this is it comes in the middle of a 12-line, I'm going to say, sentence without a single piece of punctuation anywhere in it. So you can just kind of, and it's great. It starts out with the animals. It goes to the animals and their perfected lives. Then you're in Kipling and the elephants.
Oh, right.
And then there's elephants picking up sewing needles with their trunks. And yeah, it just kind of goes on and on and on. And I don't really know where that line stops and where it begins, but I thought the chunk that I picked out was probably the right chunk.
Which page is that on, just for people listening?
Oh, yeah, sure. That is the bottom of 63.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I like that part, too.
That also is a really nice pivot into the next podcast up, because we're going to be talking a lot more about these moments where, we don't know where things begin and end, and it becomes this sort of, this fervor and this sense of sort of piling things together, and that there is a logic and a separation and a break, but you kind of have to reconstruct it as a reader.
Yeah. Yeah, so tune in next week for when you will read 10 influential sentences and 10 reciprocal sentences, along with a bunch of other things. That is one of the bits from the beginning. Anyways, well, thank you, Scott, so much. Where can people follow you online?
Yeah. You should go check me out at conversationalreading.com. You can get me at Twitter, Scott Esposito. You can friend me on Facebook, Scott Esposito.
Expositor.
On Instagram. Expositor. That is my next online moniker. I'm going to start up there. Expositor Instagram.
Yes. just pictures of you in lucha libre masks.
It's going to be some hardcore Mexican wrestling and some East German old school really Eastern stuff.
Absolutely. And Lytton, you're on, I forget, you're just Lytton Smith on Twitter, right?
I'm Lytton J. Smith.
J. Smith, that's right.
There must be someone else who got Lytton Smith before me. But yeah, Lytton
Bastards.
J. Smith. So come and say hey over there.
Yes, and please rate us on iTunes. Tell your friends. Keep listening. Buy the book. You can get it through the website at 20% off if you use the code 2month at checkout. And that's probably all we need to say this week. We'll be back next week. Until then, talk to you soon.